Good evening, everyone. Good to see each of you. Glad that you are here. We are going to pick up with our study of the book of Hebrews. And as we study through this book, my hope was that we could probably cover a chapter, a lesson. That's probably not going to happen. You know me, and that's just not the way that I work. But anyway, so we will. My goal is the first three verses tonight. So we'll see if I can accomplish that at least. We'll see. Yeah. So not even going to try a chapter. So just first three verses. But what I do hope to is study in sections, because I think that'll be helpful. There are points that are made. Again, remember that it has a sermon feel to it, and so we're going to kind of study it in sections as we cover each verse. But we'll study it in sections, and hopefully that'll move us along through this particular study. Just a reminder from our last class, we kind of ended with the purpose, and the purpose being to encourage Jewish Christians, to help them to remain faithful to Christ, not to revert back to the old law, to their old religion of Judaism. And so there is a good portion of this letter that is really focused on the supremacy of Christ, the superiority of Christ, as well as the supremacy of a new covenant, and one built upon better sacrifices with better promises. And so we find in it these passages like chapter 13, verse 13, let us go forth to him outside the camp, talking about Christ, bearing his reproach. And so calling them again to go and stay with Christ, not to go back inside the camp, but go forward to Christ, outside the camp. Fully commit yourself, in other words. And then in the middle of the letter, we find this chapter 6, let us lead the elementary doctrine of Christ and go on to maturity. And so again, not going backwards, but to continue to press forward. The Apostle Paul would write about that similarly, thinking about pressing forward to for the mark of the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus, Philippians 3 and verse 14. So pressing forward is the idea that we find here in the Hebrew letter. And just so I want this next slide is all for Steve Johnson, by the way. Here it is, Steve. He asked me why I didn't bring it up last week. So there you have it. That was all for Steve Johnson. So anyway, Hebrews it. All right, some key words. If you lay out the whole letter, you will find the word God 68 times, and that's basically one for every 78 words in the book. And so the word God obviously is the focal point. It's about his authority. It's about what he has done. It's about his plan. And that's going to come forth through that letter, because you're going to see that over and over. God, God, God. You have the word Christ 13 times. The phrase let us. Brother Raymond, in his class, he was covering some of those passages, the let us passages. Not anything to do with a salad. It's Christian salad, though. Let us. But anyway, the word better is used 13 times. You start to pick up on a couple of things, even just from the key words. The idea that better is something that he is promoting. He's promoting something better. Well, it tells us then that he's having to remind them of something that is in place, that is better than what they're trying to go to. That they're going away from that. They're giving up on the better thing, going back to something that is inferior, ultimately. Something that does not have the power to save them. Has no efficacy in the blood of animals, according to the old law, but the power to save is found in the blood of Christ. And so a better sacrifice, and so one that has better promises. You have the word eternal and the concept of the idea of eternal is found 8 times, and the word heavenly is found 6 times. And so these are just a couple of key words. helping us focus on some of those things. And so as you go through that, as we go through this, you might highlight them and see where they're used. And obviously, some of the things that we're going to pick up on that we'll find, some of these key words are going to be at some of those sections that we're going to be studying, where we'll pick up, here's another, just as in Brother Raymond's class, here's another section where let us do this. Because of what I just said, let us continue this way. And so you'll have phrases like that help you find those key points throughout the book. And so, the book of Hebrews. You will notice Christ is the selected one. He is selected by God to be the one who would reveal. Chapter 1, God. Now let's go ahead and read verses 1 to 3, but we're going to kind of focus on phrases or words as we go through this. God, who at various times and various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken to us by His Son, whom He has appointed heir of all things, through whom also He made the worlds, who being the brightness of His glory, the express image of His person, upholding all things by the word of His power, when He had by Himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And so, again, we find the idea beginning with God. And I'm going to back up. It is God who is revealing this. How these things are going to be revealed, and obviously then what He's going to reveal is going to be of importance to us to pick up on. But think about for just a moment. If you're writing to a primarily Hebrew, folks from a Hebrew background, they have been brought up since birth in what? Under what, I should say? Under the old law. And following the practices of, as we know it, Judaism, right? And in so doing, they were just naturally born into that. And of course, what the prophets taught and what Jesus taught is that all would be taught and then come to know me. They'd have to be taught. Well, those things are going to have to be revealed. But what we're going to find is that there was a revealing of that old law, and it would include both dispensations of where God spoke directly to the fathers, which we know as what? What dispensation is that? The patriarchal system, right? God spoke to the patriarchs, directly to the fathers. They were the ones who, by the way, led in the worship. They made the sacrifices. You think about Job for a minute, who sacrificed on behalf of his children. He was the head of the house, and so God dealt directly with him, as He did with Adam, as He did with Abraham. Those were the patriarchs. But there is something noteworthy, is that during that time, there was, Jude refers to a man by the name of Enoch, that he was a prophet. And so even during the patriarchal times, there were prophets. There were those who had the message of God and proclaimed it. And so they spoke on behalf of God. They took that message from God and taught it to others, whether it was just to their families or whether it was to those who were around them. And so we have, as we'll note here when we get back to our passage in just a moment, one of the things that becomes very clear is that even when then we come to the New Testament or the New Covenant, God has not been silent. God is not silent on what He expects of mankind. And you can say, okay, well, I know there was a period of about 400 years there between the Old and New Covenant where God was silent. Well, He was silent by way of prophecy, but guess what? His word was still not, it was not silent. There was still the old law in practice and being observed. God was still speaking right through those prophets. And so He wasn't silent. He's never been silent. He has always explained to man exactly what He expected of mankind. He's not left man then to his own devices. And so we have somebody like a prophet, the prophet Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 10 and verse 23, who says, Lord, I know that it's not in the way of man who walks to direct his own steps. He needs direction. And God has provided that direction for mankind. And so He has revealed those things. So let's go back to our slide here to begin with. So we begin with God. Again, 68 times through this book. And I made the point last week that you have two other times where a book begins in this fashion. What are those two books? Genesis. So Genesis 1:1, right? What did God do? God created. What other book? John chapter 1, right? And what do we read there? Who do we find out is the creator? Jesus, right? He is God. He was in the beginning with God. He is God. He is also the creator, right? All things were made by Him. Was not anything made that was made. He is creator. And so we pick up on that, and there's going to be a reference to that even in this passage, as you've already noticed probably reading on down in the next two verses. But let's think about this for just a moment. I think it's fitting that the book begins in this fashion. You have the purpose of trying to help encourage those whose arms are heavy down by their side and they're struggling. Chapter 12, we pick up on that. Those who are wavering in their faith and their Christianity, and they're going to give up and go back to the Mosaical law. And so it's fitting, I believe, that the book begins in this fashion, God. And what that does for them is it gets the attention of both those of a Jewish background or Hebrew background, as well as Christians who are reading this, because all are going to pay attention. No matter where they're at, okay, this is something that is serious. This is beginning with God. And just as it did in the book of Genesis, and just as it did in the Apostle John's writings, John chapter 1, 1 through 5, it comes down to something about authority. Whether it be creative authority or the power, and thereby He has the right to be the author, if you will, to be the one in authority. And we find this as well here in Hebrews chapter 1. And so our book starts much the same way here with an emphasis on the Father. And it's an attention grabber in many ways. And so again, I go back to the idea, yes, this kind of ends like a letter, but it reads like a sermon. I don't know if you'd read my sermons this way, but it reads like an inspired sermon, let's put it that way. So, you have this statement. And I think that it's interesting what James Burton Kaufman wrote. He says, this opening statement goes far beyond the fact of God's existence. And starkly magnificent though that fact appears, and enlightens men with some of the most significant information that is possible to have concerning God, what it reminds them is God speaks. If you take away the phrases and you get to subject and the predicate, if you will, or the subject and verb, God has spoken. That's the point. God has spoken. You want to know what the theme is to the book of Hebrews? This is it. And we could say, yes, Christ is the superior one. Christ, the supremacy of Christ. That's what I'm titling this particular study. But this is the theme. God has spoken. And therefore it's a reference to His authority. He has the right to speak. Well, let's keep moving forward. Let's notice some of the things then about what He has said or how He has said it and things like that are mentioned here in this passage. You have verse 1, the last part of it here, who at various times and various ways, and this is the New King James, at various times and various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets. And so this is kind of an all-encompassing, again, of that Old Testament time period, of both patriarchal times when God spoke directly to the fathers, but understand that even during that time there were those who carried the message of God to others as did Enoch, for example. You have the fact that you have the Mosaical age. That all falls during that Old Testament period, if you will. The patriarch and the Mosaical. So the Mosaical is simply the law of Moses. The law of Moses is given in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Moses begins to explain this is not given to everyone else around here. This is given to us. It's not even given to our fathers. It's given to us who are alive this day. So it was given to the Hebrews. It was given to the Israelites, in other words. It was directly given to them for them to follow. Now that law was given to them, and they were to be a light and an encouragement to others and to teach others and to do what they could to bring others to God in that way and live the right type of life according to the law of Moses. And in so doing, they'd be the right kind of example to all the nations around them who were worshiping other gods and so forth. And so you have this phrase, and it's interesting because you have two different words that are used here. The first one, in the King James, it says it's sundry times. It just means in many different times, at various times. The New King James says here, and the idea is more than that, though. It's about a progressive revelation, is what it's about right here at this point. Bits and pieces, little by little, piece by piece, God was revealing Himself and His will to mankind. And so you begin to pick up, that's what the first part of this phrase means. And then you have in various ways. And we can think about how God did this. You know, He had visions and dreams. He directly inspired men to speak. You know, Jeremiah says, His word was in my mouth, literally. Remember, like a fire shut up in my bones, but His word was in my tongue, literally. It was His word that was coming out. And so you have inspiration in that way. He helped Israel at a time when they're having to make certain decisions, and those decisions would be made, and God would connect with them and direct them, reveal to them what they needed to do by way of the Urim and Thummim of all things. God used a donkey on one occasion to pass along His information, His word. So in many different ways and bits and pieces, God revealed Himself to the fathers by the prophets. That's the first part. That's verse 1 that we're looking at here. And so it's interesting because you have, the Bible didn't just fall out of the sky from heaven directly to man as we read it here today. It was in bits and pieces, right? And then it was put together. We'll go back to our study on how we got the Bible last year, and it might be helpful to study those things, thinking about that. So you have this idea that God has revealed to mankind in the past and has in these last days now spoken unto us by His Son. In the last days, He has spoken to us by His Son. The writer used the phrase last days, referring to the era, if you will, that has begun some 2,000 years ago at this point. And it was already in progress by at least 30 years by the time that the Hebrews are reading it. Hath in these last days, so he's speaking of that era, we say the Christian era, versus the time of the patriarchs, Old Testament, the time of the law of Moses, Old Testament. Now we're in the Christian dispensation, or the Christian era, the New Testament. And you can see those things then starting to connect as he's talking about it here in this passage. You have then a reference here to the Christian age. The days of mere men. Here's the difference. Here's the point that he's making. And he gets straight to it. He doesn't waste any time. God, who at different ways and different times in the past, He spoke to the fathers by prophets, but now He's spoken to us by His Son. He gets straight to the point. What is the point? Well, the days of mere men delivering God's message is past. Now He has used the very Son of God as a prophet to deliver the message. That's not to diminish in any way the fact that God sent His Word through prophets to those fathers and to remind them of the law of Moses. For those, say, better part of 1,500 years. You had a written word even that was passed along to others. And so the days of a mere man delivering God's message was past. He is revealing it now through His only begotten Son. Hence, He's better than the prophets of old. He's different. He stands far above anyone else. In fact, those prophets preached about days to come. Thinking about the phrase last day. They spoke in their particular time, and they talked about days to come. Days that were yet in the future. At a future time, God's Messiah would come, and to Him you'll listen, you'll heed, you'll do what He says. Even Moses, the lawgiver, said that there's one that's coming after me. You'll need to hearken to him. You'll listen to what he has to say. Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15. Yep.
It's kind of like knowing that the whole thing is don't give up on your faith. It's right out the gate saying, you have seen absolute truth. You know what your Jewish fathers lacked. They were constantly looking forward to complete revelation. We have it now. Why are you going to go back to piecemeal, limited truth when you have the entirety of truth? And as we study this, we need to constantly be reminding, how do we apply this to today's Christian who's leaving the faith? Because, I think we should use this as a pattern, because this is where it's going to get really practical for us. So we all have friends, family, whatever, that have left the faith. And if we apply some of these principles and say, how do we parallel this argument? Like, why would you leave? This is the only absolute truth you've ever had in your hands in your life, and you're leaving it to go back into a world that has no truth. Why? And so he's starting with this very powerful argument to these Jews to not give up the most precious thing they've ever held.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. And as we keep moving forward and pick up on what's being said, and we'll move a little bit quicker now at this point. You have chapter 1, verse 2, the latter part of verse 2 and into verse 3. You have, he's made his point. The Son is God's spokesman, but he's also the Creator. And so again, keeping the focus. And as Eddie says, those who are leaving, think about what you're doing. Think about what you're leaving. You're thinking about God has sent His Son, and He is the spokesman. And God has sent His Son. He is the Creator. He is the Creator. And so we're going to pick up on that. And you have numerous phrases here. Whom He has appointed heir of all things. And there have been numerous opinions that have been, espoused as to when this appointment took place. And it's kind of an interesting study, but there are some who advocate this is after Jesus completed His redemptive work on earth and had returned to the Father's right hand. And there's arguments made for that. But maybe it's also the case, or maybe a better answer might be, that appointment actually took place before creation even, before the time of creation. In the divine councils that the Godhead was having, there was discussion about a plan, right, before the foundation of the world to save mankind, how it was going to take place. And He is appointed heir of all things. And then you have these following phrases in this passage that actually show how God would accomplish this. Having made the worlds, having purged our sins, having sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. That's how God had, in fact, accomplished the appointment of Jesus as heir of all things. And so it's in all that work that was done, the creative process of creating the worlds, creating time, creating mankind, creating laws for him to follow, and then creating a way ultimately to save him, to save us from sin. Why would they give up on that? So he's trying to remind them, before the foundation of the world, Christ was appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds. And then I would drop down and catch this other phrase, upholding all things by the word of his power. Again, this speaks to creation specifically. You have the message from God no longer delivered through prophets, as the Old Testament prophets in particular, but by the very one who made the worlds. How much more special or precious or valuable could he say that it is for him? God sent his only begotten Son to do this work, to create all things. Now here's what's interesting. The word for, that's translated in the King James and the New King James and others, the worlds, or world, that word literally means, here are the definitions. The first definition is forever, an unbroken age, perpetuity of time. The second one is the worlds, the universe, and the third one is a period of time or an age. And so you have those who say this has reference to those ages that we just mentioned. And I can see that maybe being secondary, but I also feel like it's about the creation as well. The creation first of the universe, the world that is, in which we live, and mankind himself, created in the very image of God, Genesis 1:26 through 28, and given dominion over the rest of creation, right? And yet, there is a secondary thought here about that idea of the ages, the dispensations, you might say. Because God, certainly, by creating the world, placing man on it, sun, moon, stars for times and seasons, right? So he's created time. So there's a connection that is there. But ultimately, what we see here is, again, likely I would say the aggregate of it all. It's all encompassing of all that God has made. Would it include the different ages? Yes, by way of the fact that it was created. Somebody look up for us Colossians 1, verses 16 and 17. Colossians 1, 16 and 17.
So by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist.
All right, so putting those verses together, he's the creator, and by him all things, I'm going to use the Hebrew phrase here, or the phrase we find in the book of Hebrews, he upholds all things, right? By him all things consist. Same thing that the Apostle Paul would write then there in Colossians chapter 1. In Psalm 33, beginning at verse 6, he says, by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. You see, what this is, this upholding all things, this is a Hebraism. In other words, it's a phrase that is used, just like we have southern phrases and things like that, phrases that we use that are from different areas that people are familiar with. This particular phrase, it literally means it's a command. It's an efficient command. He spoke, and it stood fast. That's what he says there in Psalm 33 and verse 9. He spoke, and it happened. But not only did it happen, it continues to happen. You see, some things were made, and by making that, he has laws then to uphold them and to keep them going for however long he sees fit. So he upholds all things by the word of his power, by the command, literally, of his words. Yes?
I think there's also maybe a linkage there. He's talking about the worlds and about creation. I tie it back into verse 1 where he talks about various ways. You go back to Romans 1:20, the creation is an evidence of God, his eternal attributes and his divine power, so that no one's without excuse. And so they not only had the word or the Mosaic law from the Old Testament, they had the prophets back then, and now they have the creation, which is everywhere around them, and it's everywhere around us to see, and now he's linking that creation to Christ. And so that had to have been a really a powerful thing for them to hear, is all this stuff around me, the mountains and the rivers and all of that, that's all because Christ spoke.
And what he said, what Paul writes there is there's no excuse, right? Folks are without excuse. Well, the same thing here for these Christians who would give up. There's no excuse for that, because what God has accomplished through his Son. And it becomes very clear. So you have revelation, creation, representation, chapter 1, verse 3. You have God's spokesman, his creator, who is the Son, and now the one who represents the Father in every way, who being the brightness of his glory. I think the New American Standard says the radiance of his glory, and the express image of his person. And so what you ultimately have here, you have Colossians 2:9, where Paul would write, in him, or in whom rather, dwells all, talking about Christ, in whom dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. In Christ. He is the very image, the very stamp, if you will, that is seen. And so the word originally was used for something that was, for the stamp that was made. Later down the course of time, it became the piece that was left behind. And so what's interesting in that, and thinking about that, is it's an exact replica. Only it's not something that's fake here. We're talking about something that is real. It is the exact image. Not just like, by the way, the word icon is not used here. It's not iconic. No, it is literally the character of it. Everything about God and his nature. Instead of, you might look at the express image of his person, you might, in some translations, you'll find the word nature there. The express image of his nature. Everything that you see and know of God, guess what? Is seen in the Christ. And guess how we know anything about God? It's through the Christ, right? It's through the Christ. No man has seen God at any time. You go back to the book of Exodus, and you find out exactly why. And even Moses having to be hidden in the cleft of the rock, and all he is allowed to see is really the after effect after God has passed by. But being with God on the mountain, on Mount Sinai, and Moses comes down, he has this radiance about him, doesn't he? Well, that's a reflective radiance. That's not Christ. Christ is not just reflecting the glory of God. He is the glory of God. That's what the verse is teaching us. He is the very glory of God. And so he is the express image in that way. So if we want to know and understand the glory of God as much as humanly possible, how do we do that? We got to know Christ through his word, right? That he is revealed given to us. And so the only way that we can know the Father is through the Son. Isn't that what he told his apostles? Right before his death, John chapter 14. Show us the Father and it will suffice us. Have I not been with you all this time? If you've seen me, then what? You've seen the Father. You've seen the Father. Consider also that the author here is not describing Jesus as he was. He's describing Jesus as he is at this current time frame with the writing. It's not just looking back to before the creation and so forth. It's looking at who he was while he was on earth. He was the glory of God. Well, we got into verse 3 at least. So we'll stop there and pick up with these phrases and study on ahead. We may get to the end of chapter 1 next week, Lord willing.